So I was sitting at lunch with a group of brilliant teachers, and as I looked around, I realized that I had the perfect prop for my talk. So you guys all noticed that at your tables, there were these amazing things, and they actually stuck the macaroons in them, which is amazing also. So this is a plant, obviously, that's grown, it's grass. And if we considered the leaves of grass as, say, a stem, the one thing that we know is that a stem without a root won't bear any fruit, right? Like if it's not embedded in something, some deep context that's kind of brown and murky and uncomfortable, the stem without root wouldn't bear fruit. And so I want everybody to repeat after me: stem with no root bears no fruit. Stem with no root bears no fruit. So a stem of a plant without any root won't be able to grow anything, won't bear fruit. STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, without root will bear no fruit, which is having a populace that is engaged and interested in STEM. So we then have to think about the traditions of STEM, or science education more broadly in this country, and understand that the root of it, the core of it, is a model that comes from schools like the Carlisle School that existed for Native American populations. They were carted into these schools to get a better education. Their culture was extracted from them in many ways, and they were forced to be something other than who they were. One of the models from that school was these two images that you see in front of you, where you had the Native American population in their own garb and dress. And the purpose of the school was to do this noble experiment of extracting out their culture and making them look like the folks who were on the other side of that image. That education actually was part of the process of not just learning information, but extracting out your culture to be something in many ways other than who you are, privileging that. In science education, we do the same thing. So that's Jizza from the Wu-Tang Clan and Albert Einstein, who probably shouldn't be on the screen together, some people ask. But we want to take people who are like Jizza, connect to Jizza, and make them into Einsteins, and they're just not the same phenotypically or otherwise. And that begs the question of, how come Jizza, who's a hip-hop scientist, the guy with the guns blazing, this intimidating kind of way, is this guy here in the same image? How do you go from that guy to the science guy? And that happened, actually, by him being able to embrace the roots of who he was. The culture, the griminess of hip-hop actually was what led him to become a scientist and conduct science research and visit science labs all over the place. But that's no different than Einstein. We've extracted out his root, which is the fact that to be a brilliant scientist, he was first an amazing violinist, a philosopher. He gathered friends together to have conversations about life. And he's thinking about those things that are seemingly unrelated to science is actually what gave him the core of becoming an amazing scientist. So if that's the case with Einstein, it should be the case with the Jizzas as well, and kids who are like Jizza, and understanding the fact that hip-hop culture in this low-brow way that people categorize it, is actually always intrigued with science. These are some science or hip-hop albums that have these rappers sort of playing with and toying with a persona of a scientist. Everything from seeing themselves as a mad scientist to creating a formula. And that same model, that same root, is a model that I argue is necessary for STEM teaching. To look at Jizza, who became a scientist on stage, and how you have an audience who's sitting at the edge of their seats, wanting to learn everything from you. There's call and response, there's engagement, it's colloquial, and that is a model for the ideal scenario for teaching kids whose roots have been extracted from teaching and learning. Like this. So this is a black church, and they turning up, and they caught the Holy Ghost. But in those spaces is the root of engagement for populations who are connected to this. And so if we're to teach STEM, we actually have to take models for teaching from spaces like these, models for teaching from hip-hop, models for teaching from areas where we think is parental advisory explicit content. Because I make the argument that if we want to connect populations who gravitate towards things that are anti-academic as we perceive them to be, it first requires going back to that root. And look, remember back to this? What are the characteristics of this root? It's dirty. It's brown. You can put your gloves on, it's still going to look that way. But out of this root is where we can transform that into progressive educational content. That the same logo for parental advisory explicit lyrics can be the very same logo for looking at progressive ways to engage in teaching and learning. Because we can take that thing that's negative and transform that into positive, and then make connections to how we can get a whole new populace engaged in our amazing and brilliant and beautiful discipline. And if we don't do that work, we become like talking heads. We become like these folks who are sitting there, and we can look all day and peek all day and say, well, that looks kind of interesting and highbrow, but that's not the work. The work is to go from beyond this person who's just looking with your eyes all over the place, and being the person who leaves that and then goes to do. So how do you do? You do by stepping into that cipher. You do by actually going into those communities to understand the nuances of the work. You do as this amazing rapper who's popular does, literally going into communities and having conversations and engaging in raps with people who they will perceive as not being of the same class. And anybody, any of us, can do that work. I'm not asking you to be a rapper. I'm asking you to go in there and understand the nuance of it. So here comes the sociology lesson, right? Understanding that there's science all around us, and there's a thing as hood science, which is like urban science. Then there's also academic science, but the conceptual understandings of science concepts are the exact same. In order for us to move from hood science to this sort of academic science, we have to understand that we have to create these things called third spaces. And third spaces are only created when we can create hybridized identities as educators to do something like my project, Science Genius, where I have kids across New York City writing academic raps about science and competing with each other, knowing that there's a kid in Brooklyn with a rap and a kid in the Bronx with a rap, and we don't know how good they are, so we have to study more science and perform that in a way that has swag and presence, but it's still academically rich and powerful. We all can do the work of doing this, where we have English language learners who don't know how to speak English when they first get into this country, and because of that, we perceive them as not being able to do science, can get on the stage, craft a rap about science with the lyrics behind them, with hip-hop artists on one side of the stage and scientists on another side of the stage, and all those folks coming together to assess the content. We don't want to just create anybody. We want to create science communicators. And we want to not avoid history and culture, like this Jeopardy episode, where all the folks answered all the questions on the board, and all that was left was African-American history. And each person looked at each other like, Alex, I am not going there. Right? And while there's humor in that, that's what a lot of us do when we fail to engage in the type of work that scares us or that we perceive as not having value. And we've done that for a very long time in this country. This is Harriet Tubman, who's presented as an icon, a hero, who led slaves to freedom. But we take out the fact that she was also a brilliant scientist who was able to look at the night sky and identify a pattern and utilize that to go through the way to find the path to lead slaves to freedom. To understand there's some ecology necessary in that as well. Look at this guy, Thomas Fuller, known by fellow slaves as the famous African calculator, who, without having the ability to read or write, had a really firm understanding of how to find measurements of casts of land and could multiply and divide just on the cuff. And so we extracted these things out, now we got to get them back in. Let me tell you why. Evolutionary biologists did a research project with zebra finches. These are birds that sing amazing songs. They mated these birds with other birds, and they realized that they sang their song by noting the song of the ancestor. So in their infinite wisdom, they extracted these birds from their generations, mated them with others, and listened to their songs. And the songs was a horrific representation of the initial song, right? But after a couple years, guess what they found out? They found out they started longing to sing the original song, that they were actually begging for an opportunity to sing the original song, and they were having cues to it. And you know why? Because they were going back to their roots. Because a stem with no root bears no fruit. And that image shows a plant with a root, and it grows, and you can't do this work of creating new teachers and new scientists without understanding that, repeat after me, a stem with no root, a stem with no root, a stem with no root. Thank you.